Hey there folks, welcome to the next in our series of videos on our Introduction to Programming course using the online Grok Learning Python course. This time we're going to be looking at Module 6, which is all about storing lists of values. We're also going to be continuing to build on and use some of the things we've already covered. Loops we're going to be talking about here as well, because loops with lists are really important and they're used together a lot of the time, and we're going to have a look at a few other concepts as well. So let's get into it, but first, before we can head into looking at lists and having a look at some of the problems, there's a few concepts that are new that you're going to come across in this module. One of those is using non-integer numeric values, so numbers that are not whole numbers. Okay, so it's decimal numbers essentially we're talking about. So if we have got an output, for instance, where we're printing 10 divided by 3, we know that that's going to give us a decimal value, 3.333, and you can see the number there. That in programming is what's called a float. Okay, so it's not an integer, and we call that a float. So we work with floats quite a bit, so we don't always have integer values, and there's different things we can do with our float values. Even if I'm printing a value or working with a value that is not going to give me a decimal number, because I'm using a float, I still get that input shown using the decimal value, even if it's a 0.0. Okay, so any division operator that produces a float is going to show us the decimal place, even if there isn't a value there. So that's something we need to be aware of, and how they're different to integers. So we can, when we're working with our our floats and integers, we might want to do some conversion from one to the other. So we can convert an integer to a float simply using the float method. So we've got an integer with a integer variable I with a value of 10. We can use a different variable and apply the float method to that variable I, which makes it become a float variable instead of it being an integer, which it was originally as 10. So when we print that, it's going to be 10.0 because it's now a float. We get the decimal value shown. If we can start with a float value and turn that into an integer, doing the reverse basically. We can start with a float variable, 10 divided by 2. We know that's going to give us 5.0 as a float, but we might want that as an integer, no decimal place shown. So we can do that by using the int method, which we've already used before. We've already seen that. And when we print that new variable of I, we're just going to get 5, not 5.0, because we've turned it from a float into an integer. We can also convert a string to an integer. So if we've got a string value 5, so it's the same value, but it's a string. We know that because it's got quotes around it. We can use the int method there as well and apply that to our string version of our variable and output that, and we will get a 5 there as well. If we turned it into a float, we'd get 5.0. So you can see that we can turn our different values, integer values and float values, convert them between each other depending on what we might want to do. Remainders is something else we'll come across here. So this is a pretty common thing you do use in programming for various things, particularly time-related stuff is a common example, but other areas as well. We use a thing called modulus, or some languages call it modulo, but it's a way of finding the remainder when we divide numbers, when we do a division operation. We don't actually care about the answer to the problem, so to speak. We just want to find what's left over, what's the remainder when that operation is performed. We call that a modulus. And in Python, the operator that represents that is the % sign. And it's the same in some other programming languages as well. Some other languages use different symbols, but Python uses the % sign. So if we have a variable called remainder and we're doing an operation there, a modulus operation, 10 divided by 3, but we are looking for the remainder from that operation, the output, if you know your maths, divide 10 into 3, you know that that's going to be 9, but we're going to have this 1 left over. So that's the output from that operation. When we print remainder, we're going to be printing the value 1, because that's what we know. We know that's what's left over when we divide 10 by 3. So that's an important point. One of the problems you'll come across uses the modulo operator, the modulus operator, the %. Earlier on in a previous module, we came across this string positions concept. where we use zero-based indexes to identify things. So that's that concept we're going to continue to use again here, but apply it a little bit differently, but the basic concept is the same. And we're going to be talking about lists in Python. Python uses the term list. Most programming languages use the term array, but they're the same thing. Okay, so all of the variables we've looked at so far, you can store one thing, one piece of data in that variable. But that's not always the case. Sometimes you want to have a variable that can store multiple pieces of data, and we use an array to do that, or in Python it's called a list. So you can think about an array as kind of like a bookshelf with a number of different slots. So the image there, think about that graphic as being like a bookshelf where there's a number of slots. Each of the slots gets labelled with a zero-based index value, so a number that represents its position, but we start counting at 0. And that's invisible. They're not actually seen by anybody. So as a programmer, you just need to know that that's there, and that's how this works. In that graphic there, we've got an array of 10 elements, but the highest index value is 9 because we start counting at 0, this zero-based concept. So we can use the index value to identify the specific position of any element in our list. And I've been using the term element because that's what the term we use to describe the items that are in our list or our array. And the index number is a very important concept. So how do we use those then? We can do lots of things with lists. If we want to just create a list, an empty list, we create them very much like our other variables, because a list is just a type of variable, special type of variable that can store multiple items. So if I've got an array, a list I want to create called myfoods, I do that using the equal operator and a set of square brackets. So the square brackets are the list characters that identify that I'm working with a list. And that's an empty list because there's nothing in the square brackets at the moment. If I want to put things in my list, populating the list we call that, so I can just put things inside those square brackets and I've got items in my list. In this case I'm putting 3 string values in there, pizza, cake and chips. Pizza is in position 0, cake's in position 1, chips is in position 2 as the index values for that. I can mix those up. Don't have to have all strings. I can have a mixture of strings and numeric values. I can have all numeric values. I can have whatever I want in the elements of my array. If I then want to access one of those elements, if I use the code and I'll print myfoods1, then I am going to be outputting the value cake because that's the value that is in that position. If I use -1, this is interesting, I can also access values of an array if I work backwards. So -1 means I go out to the right hand end and I'm accessing the element that is in the first position on the right hand side rather than the left. So that's chips because that's in the minus. So we can use negative values to access array elements from the end of the array, not just counting from the beginning. We can do other things as well. If I want to, if I put some elements in my array, the program runs, I want to add some more elements. I can do that using the append method. So .append onto my array name, and I can add a new element into my array. So I can see that that item is added as a new item on the end of the array. I can my elements. I might want to sort them in either ascending order, A to Z, or numerical order, and the sort method, the .sort method, will do that. That simply sort the items in the array in ascending order. I can also sort them in descending order using the .reverse method. That will in reverse alphabetical order, or Z to A, or in descending if they are numbers. So I can use those methods to do certain things. One of the things that we'll do is we might want to get a list of items from the user. So often we'll have an empty array and we'll populate that with items that we ask for from the user. So we've used this line of code a bit. In this case I'm calling it data. We're using the input command and we're asking the user a question. And we're going to split that data, a method called .split, and have the input that the user gives me spread across the elements of a myfoods array. And if I can then use a loop to loop through that list, I can loop through the individual food items in the My Foods list, and I can print those items out. And that is a really common thing that we do in programming with arrays. We use loops to help us those arrays and work with the items in my array.